Iran did not calmly choose a new ruler. Senior insiders say the Revolutionary Guards forced Murtabak Khamenei through as supreme leader, which means the most important succession in the region may have been settled by the security state. Before, it was dressed up as clerical consensus. That is where the story starts. Before the country heard his voice, missiles were already flying in his name. That means Murtabak Khamenei entered power through force, before familiarity, through war, before public presence. A man the public barely knew was instantly turned into a battlefield symbol. 6 days after being named supreme leader, the Iranian people still had not seen him or heard him. In a country under bombardment, under assassination threats, under succession panic, the regime was asking millions to accept an invisible leader at the exact moment visibility should matter most. That is not normal authority. That is controlled darkness. If you want the layer beneath the ceremony, subscribe now. And tell me in the comments what sounds worse to you. A revenge-driven heir with missiles behind him, or a regime so militarized, it no longer needs its ruler to be visible. The title does not promise a biography, it promises a discovery. Who is this man? Why did the guards want him? And why does the system look almost more dangerous the less the public can actually see of him? Because nobody knows him is not just a curiosity hook, it is the key to the whole transfer. In a moment like this, obscurity is not a handicap. Obscurity is leverage. A famous successor arrives, with enemies, expectations, and old political scars already attached to him. A hidden successor arrives, empty enough for the regime to fill him with whatever it needs. Continuity, vengeance, piety, discipline, fear. That is what makes a figure like Murtabak usable in a crisis. Murtabak Khamenei was not rolled out as a familiar national figure, stepping into disaster. He was described as a secretive figure who was not seen publicly, even after the strike that killed his father and shattered the old command center. So when people click this title asking who this man is, they are reacting to something real. Iran really did elevate a successor most people barely know, and that is the first layer beneath the headline. The public did not know him well, because public recognition was never his job. He was built for the back rooms, the office corridors, the whisper networks, the places where access matters more than applause. That matters because wartime succession is not a talent contest. It is not even really about charisma. It is about who can be installed fast, who can be protected, who can calm the right armed institutions, and who can inherit the system without first needing to introduce himself to it. Murtabak fits that profile almost too perfectly. He has the bloodline without the public scrutiny. He has the clerical packaging without a democratic base. He has the right relationships without ever needing to fight for mass legitimacy in the open. And in a state under decapitation pressure, that is not a side detail. That is selection logic. The less publicly defined he was, the easier it became for the regime to define him on its own terms, before the country could decide what he represents. Years before this succession, Murtabak had already been identified as acting for the supreme leader in an official capacity, despite never being elected or appointed to government office. So he was not a nobody inside the machine. He was a shadow official, operating with delegated power long before the public had any reason to focus on him. That single fact destroys the lazy version of this story. He was not unknown to the people who matter most in the system. He was unknown to the public, which is very different. The regime had years to learn him, trust him, use him, and position him while keeping him largely outside public accountability. That is exactly the kind of profile a military security establishment likes in a successor during chaos. Not a man who arrives with an independent constituency, a man whose legitimacy is attached upward to the bloodline and sideways to the institutions keeping the state alive. So when people hear nobody knows him, they should hear something colder than mystery. They should hear control. A successor who belongs more to the apparatus than to the population is easier to move, easier to shield, and easier to turn into a vessel for continuity under fire. Formally, this office is not symbolic. Murtabak Khamenei now has a central say in Iran's war strategy, with the Revolutionary Guard answering to him in the state hierarchy. That means the unknown heir now sits over decisions involving missiles, escalation, internal repression, and regime survival. If that formal picture is true in full, then the danger is obvious. Iran has placed wartime command in the hands of a man shaped in secrecy, tied closely to the security apparatus, and elevated in the shadow of his father's killing. That is not the profile of a calming transition. But there is a second possibility, and it may be even worse. He may hold the office while the most decisive operational power sits increasingly with the guards beneath him. If that is the real arrangement, then Iran did not merely select a leader. It sealed a military state structure behind a clerical face. That is why the silence matters so much. A leader who cannot be seen is unnerving. A regime that does not seem to need him to be seen is a different level of problem altogether, because public absence usually creates vacuum. Here, it did not. The machine kept moving. Loyalty rituals appeared. War signaling continued. The state behaved as if legitimacy could be postponed because functionality had already migrated elsewhere. The regime's own selection logic was laid out with brutal clarity. The candidate, it was said, had been picked according to the late leader's advice that Iran's top ruler should be hated by the enemy, not praised by it. So this was never just a search for the most stable pair of hands. It was a search for the most politically survivable hardline symbol, under siege. That line should change how you hear everything that followed. Because once hatred by the enemy becomes a qualification, then public threats from Washington or Jerusalem stop weakening a candidate and start certifying him. The more loudly he is rejected outside, the more defensible he becomes inside. That is how war distorts succession. It turns ideological extremity into protective coloration. It punishes moderation by making it look suspect. It narrows the field until the candidate who best embodies defiance also, but becomes the one safest from accusations of softness. And this is exactly where outside pressure may have backfired. The regime was not picking in a calm room. It was picking under bombardment, under decapitation trauma, under fear of internal fracture, and under the gaze of enemies openly talking about who should and should not be allowed to rule Iran. Next, one of the toughest reads on this transition made the point directly. The most significant factor in Mojtaba's selection may have been Donald Trump. Once the American president publicly signaled that Khamenei's son was unacceptable, resisting Mojtaba inside Iran became politically riskier. In a siege mentality, foreign rejection can become domestic endorsement. That is the paradox sitting at the heart of this whole event. The more Washington tried to shape the psychological field, the more the regime had reason to reject any option that looked less confrontational. In systems like this, outside interference does not always split the hardline bloc. Sometimes it glues it together. So if you are asking why the guards would choose a successor, nobody knows. Part of the answer is timing. They did not need a figure who could charm the public. They needed a figure who could survive ideological scrutiny inside a system now allergic to the slightest scent of foreign approval. A hidden son with the right lineage and the right security ties could do that. A visibly pragmatic figure probably could not. Not after the old leader was killed. Not after the rhetoric escalated. Not after the regime convinced itself it was in a fight for the whole structure. Israel then stripped away the traditional protective aura of succession. It warned that any successor, no matter his name or where he hides, would be an unequivocal target for elimination. So Mojtaba rose not into a secure throne, but into an office openly marked for death, before he had even fully entered public sight. That warning is not just another headline in the chain. It helps explain the eerie shape of the transition itself. A leader under active external threat can be hidden for protection. But if the state keeps functioning while he remains hidden, the deeper lesson is not about his vulnerability, it is about the regime's architecture. Maybe he was being protected. Maybe he was injured. Maybe the system needed time to stabilize him. Fine, none of that weakens the larger conclusion. If Iran can continue to project authority while its new supreme leader remains largely unseen, then authority is already being carried elsewhere. And once that becomes true, the title's real menace comes into focus. Silent is not just about Mojtaba's personal absence. It may be about a regime learning to govern through structured opacity, where the visible leader matters less than the institutions acting in his name. That is the kind of shift that makes a country harder to read and harder to deter, not because it is stronger in every sense, but because its public surface tells you less and less about where decisions are actually being made. As the war pressure intensified, one judgment captured the emerging order with lethal precision. The decisive voice was not the civilian leadership, but the IRGC. That line is the hinge of the entire story. Because if the decisive voice is there, then the succession was never only about replacing a supreme leader. It was about formalizing who already had the weight to decide the next phase. Now the title sounds even darker. The guards did not just choose a successor nobody knows because they lacked options. They may have chosen him because an unfamiliar man with the right pedigree creates less resistance when the real aim is to protect the center of coercive power. A stronger, more independent cleric could have complicated things. A broader, more publicly rooted figure could have widened bargaining inside the elite. A true national reconciler could have threatened the hardline wartime frame. Motaba offered something more valuable to the security state than any of that, dependence wrapped in legitimacy. And that is why the whole thing feels so unsettling. It has the surface of continuity but the emotional texture of a takeover. The same office remains, the same bloodline continues, but the bounds under the office may be shifting toward the part of the system built for war, repression, and survival at any cost. Once you see that, the invisibility stops looking accidental. It starts looking functional. The less publicly fixed the new leader is, the more room there is for the guards to turn him into what they need him to be. There was also institutional redundancy beneath the shock. Within hours of the strike, an interim council emerged under Article 111 of the Constitution, which means the system had a mechanism to keep moving. While succession was sorted out, Iran did not face a blank void. It faced a compressed struggle over what kind of state would emerge from the void. That distinction matters. Decapitation does not always collapse a regime. Sometimes it reveals which institutions were already prepared to inherit the real work of rule. Here, the answer keeps pointing back to the security structure, and that should worry anyone who thought killing the old leader would automatically produce paralysis, moderation, or democratic opening. Systems under existential stress often do the opposite. They reduce debate, centralize force, and treat ambiguity as weakness. That is exactly the direction this succession appears to point. Narrower legitimacy, harder discipline, more dependence on the part of the state that knows how to survive under attack, because surviving under attack is what it was built for, which means the deeper consequence is bigger than Motaba himself. Even if he later emerges, even if he speaks, even if he consolidates, the fact pattern of his rise has already told us something crucial. The post-Ali Khamenei's order seems less interested in public persuasion than in command continuity. And command continuity in this kind of system does not come from trust. It comes from networks, fear, ideology, and the ability to keep enough armed men, enough institutions, and enough clerical symbolism aligned long enough to outlast. The shock, the public fracture, was immediate enough to be heard in the streets. Verified video captured chants of death to Motaba and death to the lackey, which means this was not a seamless handover wrapped in universal fear and obedience. The regime inherited resistance the same night it demanded continuity. And that resistance hits the regime in a place it cannot easily explain away. This is a state born in revolution, against monarchy. It built decades of ideological language around rejecting inherited rule. Yet under maximum pressure, it appears to have accepted the logic of bloodline survival anyway. That contradiction poisons the whole succession. A son replacing a father in wartime, under pressure from the guards, while remaining hidden from the public, does not feel like revolutionary legitimacy. It feels like emergency dynastic preservation inside an armed fortress. The regime can still stage loyalty. It can still flood squares with flags and portraits. It can still manufacture the image of continuity. But the deeper emotional memory is harder to erase. Millions were asked to accept an unknown heir before they were even allowed to truly meet him. That is why the title lands, not because Motaba is mysterious in some glamorous sense, because his obscurity may be the cleanest evidence of what the succession was designed to do. He was not chosen despite being unknown. He may have been chosen because being unknown made him easier to install, easier to shield, and easier to control. So now we can answer the click, the way the audience actually wanted it answered. Iran's silent new leader is not just a reclusive cleric stepping out of his father's shadow. He is a succession instrument built in shadow, elevated under fire, and surrounded by signals that the Revolutionary Guards wanted continuity on terms they could dominate. If Motaba is the real commanding force, then Iran has entered a more dangerous phase. Under a wartime heir whose rise was forged in secrecy, trauma, and deep alignment with the security state. If he is not the real commanding force, then the more chilling truth is that Iran has drifted toward a model where the Supreme Leader's office provides religious cover while the decisive voice sits elsewhere. Either way, the same conclusion survives. This succession did not broaden the system. It narrowed it. It did not humanize the regime. It hardened it. It did not make it made the real center of gravity even harder to see. And the image that should stay with you is still the first one. Before the public got reassurance, before they got a speech, before they got a face, they got missiles fired in his name. That is not a footnote. That is the transfer of power in one scene. A hidden heir, a forced succession, a militarized state, a population asked to accept continuity without clarity. That is not just a new chapter in Iran. It may be the moment the Islamic Republic revealed that, after Ali Khamenei, it no longer needs its leader to be known at all, only obeyed. Stay subscribed. This channel follows the power shifts hidden behind the spectacle, and that is where the next real move will happen first.